Recording is on, but I've got to stop the transcription. Okay, so before we start, good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon, sir.
Good
All right.
afternoon, sir.
Yes.
Okay, so the reason I gave a little extra time is because today's topic is the longest and most difficult in the whole semester. As you are soon going to find out from your colleagues in other groups, some of them are going to take this course for 2 to 3 weeks. But if you listen very carefully, I will give you what you need to know about this course within 2 hours. Normally, my students don't get confused when I teach them, so I'm quite proud of that. So we're going to go through today's topic carefully, deliberately, and then we shall be doing exercises at each point so that we understand it before we move on to the next point. So that's how we're going to, master the topic of the deductive reasoning. Okay, so now I'm going to disable your microphones so that no one can talk until I am done. Then I'll open up your microphones for questions. Anyway, I would open your microphones very soon when we want to do the first exercise, which is not far away. So today we are looking at deductive reasoning. By way of an introduction, welcome to the second half of the semester. The first half was a preparation for the second. And the first half of the semester, which ended last week, we studied concepts in language and meaning. We studied statements, logical statements that we don't normally interpret as logical. We studied statements that should not be, interpreted literally. Okay. We also learned to identify different types of passages. And then we learned about what kind of passage is argumentative and what type is not, such as narratives, instructional passage, polemic, Now it is time to study arguments. Now, arguments are also called reasoning. Let me ask you guys if you are seeing the slides. Sorry, I want to open up the microphone to see you. My cursor is not, it looks like my system is slow. Okay, so I think you are seeing the slides, but because it reads here, stop sharing. So that means it's currently sharing. All right. Arguments are also called reasoning or syllogisms. Arguments, reasoning, syllogisms. The three terms are used interchangeably. Now, two major categories of reasoning are inductive and deductive. We also have causal reasoning, but that's a form of inductive reasoning. Okay. Okay, so please, are you guys seeing the slides very clearly? Is there any
Yes, please.
is
Yes,
there
sir.
an obstruction? Is there any
Yes, we
obstruction
can
to
see.
any part of the
Yes,
slide?
please. No.
Yes,
Okay, so
please.
is any part of the slide obstructed by
You
any?
can't see you. Me, I can't see.
Then that's a network problem if others can
Yeah,
see.
everything is in view.
Okay,
Yeah, we can see everything clearly.
all right. Um, okay, so now, so we are saying that arguments are also called reasoning or syllogisms, and the three terms are used interchangeably. Now, two major categories of reasoning are deductive and inductive reasoning. So we have deductive and inductive reasoning. We also have causal reasoning, but that's a form of inductive reasoning. So let's begin with deductive reasoning, which is our topic today. Deductive reasoning is also called deductive argument, deductive syllogism. It is reasoning in which the relationship between the premises and the conclusion is a logical relationship. The relationship between the premises and the conclusion is a logical relationship. As a result of this, it is reasoning that permits only one conclusion. It is the kind of reasoning or argument or syllogism that permits only one conclusion. Example, all men are mortal. Kofi is a man, so Kofi is mortal. Now, if you say that all men are mortal, and you also say that Kofi is a man, then it's inescapable that Kofi is mortal. You cannot change and modify the conclusion and say, for example, Kofi is immortal or a far cabinet is mortal. It's only one possible conclusion. Now I'm taking this analysis from the other critical thinking book in the bookshop because this is not in your required textbook, you know. But without it, a lot of you will be confused about what a deductive. Up till now, a lot of past students are asking what is deductive argument. They don't really know what it is. So we are using a first class scenario to teach you exactly what a deductive argument is and how to identify it firsthand. You know, the conclusion of a deductive argument cannot be two; it can only be one. Now deductive arguments are mathematical arguments. You know, they are mathematical arguments. How do you do the mathematics? Now, if you look at premise one here, you see all men. That's the first concept or the first term, all men. And then you see mortal, all men. You see all men, and then you see are mortal. In premise two, you see Kofi, and then you see it's a man. Now, so between premises one and two, you have men appearing twice. You have all men in premise one, you have man in premise two. And then between premises one and two, you have mortal and Kofi appearing once. So you have men appearing twice, and you have mortal and Kofi appearing once. By mathematical deduction, those ones that appeared only once are the ones that are going to form the conclusion. So the conclusion is all about Kofi and mortal. When you have a conclusion featuring Kofi and mortal, it means that now the argument now contains two instances of the three terms. It means that men appear twice, mortal twice, Kofi twice. So the conclusion will balance the number of those terms in the argument. That's why we said among other reasons, that deductive arguments are just mathematical calculations. All men are mortal. That's one. Kofi is a man. Therefore, one has to be the other, and that has to be, it can't be mortal is Kofi. It will be Kofi is mortal. So that balances it out. It's like 2 plus 2, 4. 3 plus 3, 6. 5 plus 5, 10. The same way. That's also why we say that deductive arguments can only have one conclusion. Now, 2 plus 2 cannot have more than one conclusion. 5 plus 5 cannot have more than one conclusion. So deductive arguments share that mathematical accuracy with mathematics or arithmetics. Now, before we start to understand, in order to help us to begin to understand deductive arguments, we need to make a number of clarifications. The very first clarification is the difference between reference and attribute classes. You have two classes of terms in one sentence, two classes of terms. Now, there are two parts of a sentence, like you have the subject and a predicate. The reference class is what we call the subject. You remember the definiendum is what we call the subject in definitions. Now, for arguments, the subject is reference class. And then the predicate, which is the definitions for definitions, is called the attribute class for arguments. So for the purpose of argumentation, you have reference class, attribute class. For example, all men are mortal. All men is the reference class, which we call the subject in English grammar. And then are mortal is the attribute class, which we call the predicate in grammar, The reference class is that to which the sentence refers, whereas the attribute class is that part of the sentence that is attributing something to or saying something about the reference class. So the reference class is that part of the sentence that the sentence is saying something about or referring to. And then the attribute class is that part of the sentence that is saying something about the reference class. So you can see why they are called reference and attribute classes. Now they are also called classes because they contain items. They are called classes because they contain items. Now, if you look at the reference class, it contains the items all men. The reference class here contains the items all men. The attribute class contains the item are mortal. We'll see more of that as we move on. When you come to the reference class, we have two types of reference class. We have reference class can be finite or infinite. Infinite reference class refers to all members or no members of a class, either 100% or 0%. It refers to all members or no members of a class, either 100% or 0%. That's the infinite reference class. Example, all men, no man, any man. That's all, none, all, none, any. That's the infinite. An infinite class, reference class, is a class of uncountable items. An infinite reference class is a class of uncountable items. These classes are uncountable. These items are uncountable. All men are uncountable. No man is uncountable. Any man is uncountable. Now, the finite reference class refers to particular members of a class. Any number between 0% and 100%. Example, some men. 80% of men. So the finite reference class refers to countable or particular. The items must be countable. That's why we call it the particular reference, the finite reference class. Finite means something that can be accounted for, something that can be counted, something that has limit, something that can be measured. That's finite. Example, some men, 80% of men, 5 men, 3 men, 1 man, all the men. Now remember that all the men is different from all men. All men is uncountable, but all the men are countable. All the men in this class, all the men in this university, all the men in this town, they can all be countable. Once the definite article V is there, then you know it's countable. Few men, almost all the men, etc. Now, another clarification that's very important is the distinction between universal and particular statements. Universal statements containing the infinite reference class are called universal statements, whilst those containing the finite reference classes are called particular statements. Example of universal statements: all men are mortal. So statements containing the infinite reference class are universal statements. All men are mortal. Statements containing the finite reference class are particular statements. Example: some men drink alcohol. Okay. Let's do a little exercise. Which statements are universal and which are particular? 1. This table is 3-legged. Is it a universal or a particular statement? So you can raise your hands. You can attempt to answer the question. Yeah, Priscilla, please answer the question.
Sir, please, it's particular statement.
Okay, particular statement. And then number 2, tables can be sat on. Tables can be sat on. Is that Nathaniel?
Yes, please. Universal
Yeah.
statement.
Universal. And number 3, James and Mary passed the examination. Who do we have there? Boateng.
Particular
Boateng.
statement.
Particular statement. And then all visitors must be treated with respect. All visitors must be treated with respect. Okay, Vida said. Vida, you said what?
Please, universal statement.
Universal statement, then that's fine. Okay. So let's move on. Now we come to the question of validity. Validity, let me mute everyone. Validity. Now, validity is what distinguishes deductive from inductive arguments. An argument is valid if the premises make the conclusion necessary and the conclusion follows with certainty. An argument is valid if the premises make the conclusion necessary. If the premises make the conclusion necessary and the conclusion follows with certainty. It's good for you to note these 2 particular things. That if the premises make the conclusion necessary and the conclusion follows with certainty, just think about that. for some seconds before I show you the example. All valid arguments are deductive arguments. Inductive arguments are strictly not valid. So inductive arguments are out. They are not valid. They can't be valid. A valid argument is an operation like 2 plus 2 equals 4. That's what a valid argument means. Anything less than such a mathematical operation where the premises like 2 plus 2 make the conclusion 4 necessary and the conclusion 4 follows with certainty. Such an argument, if it doesn't have those properties, cannot be a valid argument. It is good you understand this before we start going into the intricacies. We start going into some examples where you see it playing out. So we said inductive arguments are strictly not valid. And that's because deductive argument is a purely mathematical argument, which, as we said, the relationship between the premises and the conclusion is logical one. So we had used an example to show that all men are mortal. Kofi is a man, so Kofi is mortal. It's a strictly logical argument. There's nothing you can do to change the conclusion of this argument. Okay. Okay, let's compare it to an inductive argument. So this is an example of an inductive argument. Premise 1, 95% of men are honest. 2, Peter is a man, therefore Peter is honest. Now, when you look at this argument, you can ask yourself, does the conclusion follow with certainty? Do the premises make the conclusion necessary? Does the conclusion follow the premises with certainty? Certainty means that a conclusion is guaranteed as correct. Premise 1 says 95% of all men. And then premise 2 says Peter is a man. Now, 95% of all men drink alcohol and Peter is a man. So the conclusion is that Peter is honest. Sorry, 95% of men are honest. Peter is a man, therefore Peter is honest. Now you can see that the premises don't make this conclusion necessary. And the conclusion doesn't follow with certainty. I mean, the conclusion is not certain because Peter could be among the 5% of men that are dishonest. So the conclusion doesn't follow with certainty. And secondly, which is a lesson I learned from the other critical thinking book, more than one conclusion is possible. In fact, possible conclusion 1, Peter is honest. Possible conclusion 2, Peter is not honest. If Peter is among the 95% of men, then conclusion 1 will hold. If Peter is among the 5% of men, then conclusion 2 will hold. But you don't have enough information between premises 1 and 2 to guarantee you that Peter is honest. The premises don't have the required information to assure you that Peter is honest. Therefore, the argument can lead to 2 conclusions, even contradicting each other. That's the fastest way to identify an inductive argument. Once you see that an argument can lead to 2 different conclusions that don't even agree, then you know that such an argument is an inductive argument. If it is an argument that leads you to only one conclusion, then you know it's a deductive argument. Now let's go into the final clarification that will help us properly understand deductive arguments. Now this clarification is about the conditional if and then. If and then. Before now, you might have known that the two words if and then, when you see then appearing in a sentence, that sentence is called a conditional statement. If you see if and then appearing in a sentence, then it means that sentence is a conditional statement. Now, there are two ways of looking at arguments. We can look at arguments in categorical or conditional ways. All arguments have hidden conditionals. You need to appreciate that. All arguments have hidden conditionals. Now look at this categorical statement. All men are mortal. All men are mortal. And then look at the conditional version. If you want to translate the statement, all men are mortal, into a conditional version. If something is a man, then it is mortal. If something is a man, then it is mortal. That's the conditional version of all men are mortal. If something is a man, then it is mortal. Now, we had given an example before about Peter, or is it Kofi? Now, change the categorical statement of the previous argument, the previous example, into a conditional statement. If you look at the previous argument, all men are mortal. If you are to translate all men are mortal into a conditional statement, what do you get? What do you get? If something is a man, then it is mortal. Categorical statement, all men are mortal. Conditional version, if something is a man, then it is mortal. Let's replace with symbols. Now, this is the categorical version. All men are mortal, all A's are B's. All A's are B's. Peter is a man, X is an A. Peter is a man, X is an A. Peter is mortal, X is a B. All men are mortal, all A's are B's. Peter is a man, X is an A. Peter is mortal, X is a B. Okay. Let's look at the conditional version. If something is a man, then it is mortal. Peter is a man, therefore Peter is mortal. If A, then B. If A, then B. X is an A, therefore X is A, B. If A, then B. X is an A, therefore X is A, B. Or you can say if A, then B. A, then therefore B. Now let's look at the penultimate clarification. A clarification that will lead us into the four kinds of deductive arguments. Antecedents and consequence. These are the two terms that we use most frequently when we work with deductive arguments. Now remember the reference class and the attribute class. If we restate any categorical proposition as a conditional statement, the reference class becomes the antecedent and the attribute class becomes the consequent. Now remember that we had said all men are mortal. All men is the reference class. Are mortal is the attribute class. Now, if you say all men are mortal, if you change it to a conditional statement, if something is a man, then it is mortal. The first part, the reference class, we call it the antecedent. If something is a man, it's the antecedent. Then it is mortal is the consequent. Example, or A or B, or if A, then B. Or A or B, or if A, then B. The reference class, in this case, A, is the antecedent. And the attribute class, in this case, B, is the consequent. I want you to digest this properly before we move on. So A is the antecedent and B is the consequent. So when you say all men are mortal, if something is a man, then it is mortal. So all men is the antecedent. All men, or if something is a man, they are all antecedents. Are mortal, or then it is a man. Are mortal, or then it is a man. We call all of them consequent. So, in fact, to avoid a long story, the first part of the sentence is the antecedent. The second part of the sentence is the consequent. Of course, you know that antecedent means what comes before. Consequent means what comes after. So it's not surprising that the first part of the sentence is the antecedent and then the second part is the consequent. So it's that simple. I mean, it doesn't need any complex logic. The first part is the antecedent. The second part is the consequent. So any statement referring to A would be either affirming or denying the antecedent, and any statement referring to B would be either affirming or denying the consequent. Now, it is not all the sentences in an argument that we divide into antecedents and consequent. The only sentence where you can find the antecedent and the consequent is what? Is the major premise. Let's go back to this. All men are mortal. Kofi is a man, therefore Kofi is mortal. The only sentence where you can find the antecedent and a consequent is that one that you can translate into a conditional. Now, out of these three statements, the only sentence you can translate into a conditional is all men are mortal. If you look at premise 2 and conclusion, you cannot translate them into a conditional. You can't translate Kofi is a man into a conditional. You can't translate Kofi is mortal into a conditional. The only sentence you can translate into a conditional is premise 1, all men are mortal. If something is a man, then it is mortal. So that's the only sentence that you divide into antecedent and consequent. We normally call it the major premise, or rather I call it the major premise. Now, that one is not in your required text. Your required text doesn't go as far as making all those explanations. We call it the major premise, premise 1, because that is the only premise you can translate into a conditional, and that is the premise which will divide into antecedent and consequent. So let's go down and continue from where we stopped. So the first part of the major premise is the antecedent, and the second part is the consequent. In the case of this example, A is the antecedent and B is the consequent. So any statement referring to A will be affirming, either affirming or denying the antecedent. And any statement referring to B will be either affirming or denying the consequent. Let's look at examples. Now, X is an A. Now, remember that what we're doing is all A are B. All A are B, or if A, then B. That's the major premise. Now, this is an example of 4 kinds of minor premises. We said any statement referring to the first part of the major premise will be either affirming or denying the antecedent. And any statement referring to the second part of the major premise will be either affirming or denying the consequent. Now, here are some examples. X is an A, affirms the antecedent. X is not an A, denies the antecedent. X is a B, affirms the consequent. X is not a B, denies the consequent. So you can see how it works. X is an A, X is not an A, they affirm or deny the antecedent. X is a B, X is not a B, affirm or deny the consequent. So let's look at a complete argument that affirms the antecedent. Affirming the antecedent. All A's are B's, X is an A, therefore X is a B. You can see that in this argument, the second or the minor premise, X is an A, is affirming the antecedent. For this reason, we say that the whole of this argument is an argument that affirms the antecedent. If the second premise or the minor premise is affirming the antecedent, we usually say that the whole argument is affirming the antecedent. Now, denying the antecedent. All A's are B's, X is not an A, therefore X is not a B. You can see that the second and the minor premise here is denying the antecedent. So for that reason, we say that the whole argument is an example of an argument that denies the antecedent. Affirming the consequent. All A's are B's, X is a B, therefore X is an A. Now, the minor premise is affirming the consequence. So for that reason, we'll say that this is an argument that affirms the consequent. The whole argument is an argument that affirms the consequence. Or the whole argument is an example of an argument that affirms the consequent. Denying the consequent. All A's are B's, X is not a B, therefore X is not an A. So the minor premise is denying the consequent, and for that reason, we'll say that the whole argument is an argument that denies the consequent. So you have 4 types of arguments. We have arguments that for, let's say, 4 categories of arguments, or 4 groups of arguments, or 4 divisions of arguments. We have arguments that affirm the antecedent. Then we have arguments that deny the antecedent. We have arguments that affirm the consequent, and we have arguments that deny the consequent. 4 categories of arguments. But there are other kinds of arguments apart. It's not all arguments that do these 4 things. We have other kinds of arguments. We have hypothetical arguments. We have disjunctive arguments. They are outside this analysis. Now, this is a rule for deductive reasoning. We only affirm the antecedent and deny the consequent in order to reach a valid conclusion. We only affirm the antecedent or deny the consequent in order to reach a valid conclusion. So, okay, any other operation will make the argument lose its validity. So what this is saying is that out of the 4 categories of arguments, only 2 categories are valid. The other 2 categories are invalid arguments. That's what it is saying. We only affirm the antecedent and deny the consequent in order to reach a valid conclusion. So that means the only valid arguments are arguments that affirm the antecedent and arguments that deny the consequent. So what it means is that arguments that deny the antecedent and then those that affirm the consequent are invalid arguments. Okay, let's look at examples. All A's are B's. X is an A, which affirms the antecedent. Therefore, X is a B. We say this is a valid argument because it affirms the antecedent. Now, the second one, all A's are B's. X is not an A, which denies the antecedent. Therefore, X is not a B. We say this is not a valid argument, or this is an invalid argument. Now, let's convert it to words so that you begin to get a sense of what we're saying. All Ghanaians are Africans. Peter is a Ghanaian, which affirms the antecedent. Therefore, Peter is an African. We said it is a valid argument. The second one, all Ghanaians are Africans. Peter is not a Ghanaian, which denies the antecedent. Therefore, Peter is not an African. We say it is not a valid argument. Why is the first one valid and the second one is not valid? To show you why, I'm going to use illustrations. Now, these illustrations are in the textbook in the Kingdom Bookshop. They are not in your required text. That's why those students that depend on the required text, they often get confused. Now, let me get the box. There are 2 boxes here. We have the larger box containing Africans and the smaller box containing Ghanaians. Then we have the larger box here. The larger box is called contains consequence, and the smaller box contains antecedents. Now, when you go back to that argument, all Ghanaians are Africans. So Ghanaians is the antecedent. Africans is the consequent. Now, the reason why the first, the affirming the consequent leads to a valid conclusion and denying the antecedent doesn't lead to a valid conclusion is that the consequent contains a class of items that are usually more than that of the antecedent. The consequent is usually a larger class of items compared to the antecedent. Anytime you are to compare the sizes of the classes of the antecedents and the consequent is always larger than the antecedent. When you say all Ghanaians are Africans, already you can see that the consequent Africans is a larger class of items compared to the class Ghanaians. I mean, Africans contains many African countries apart from Ghana. So the term Africans is a larger class of items. And it is always the case. When you say all these are these, all these are these, the consequence is logically larger than the antecedent. You might get a case where both of them are the same size. The consequent is exactly the same size as the antecedent, but the consequent would never be smaller than the antecedent. It will never be smaller. Africans can never be smaller than Ghanaians. Somebody is raising their hands. So let me open up your microphone. Jessica is raising her hand. Jessica, do you want to ask a question? Jessica. Okay. So when you say all Ghanaians are Africans, and you confirm that Peter is a Ghanaian, then automatically Peter is an African. So let's go back to the diagram. Now in these two boxes, the boxes containing the antecedent is squarely in the boxes containing the consequence. So it means that everything in the antecedent is also in the consequent. If you say that Peter is in the antecedent box, then it means he's also in the consequent box. That is why affirming the antecedent will always lead you to a valid conclusion. All the antecedents are consequent. Peter is an example of the antecedent, therefore Peter is an example of a consequent. All Ghanaians are Africans. Peter is a Ghanaian, therefore Peter is an African. So if you are able to identify something as existing in the smaller box, then it means automatically, and as a matter of guarantee, that thing is also in the bigger box. That's all. But if you want to deny the antecedent, if you say that Peter is not in the smaller box, Peter is not among those in the smaller box, therefore Peter is not among those in the consequent box, the argument is not a guarantee. The argument is not valid. Can you say that just because Peter is not in the antecedent box, it means that Peter is nowhere in the consequent box? So that's why we say the argument is invalid. Just because Peter is not in the antecedent box doesn't mean that he is absent from the consequent box. I mean, Peter could be any other place in the consequent box apart from the antecedent box. So if you deny that Peter is in the antecedent box, you have not therefore denied that he is in the consequent box. In other words, denying that Peter is in the antecedent box doesn't give enough reason to deny that he's in the consequent box. That's why we say that any argument denying the antecedent does not lead to a valid conclusion about the consequence. You can see it here, Ghanaians and Africans. All Ghanaians are Africans. Peter is a Ghanaian, therefore Peter is an African. That's valid, because once Peter is a Ghanaian, then definitely Peter is an African. But if you say all Ghanaians are Africans, Peter is not a Ghanaian, therefore Peter is not an African, that's not a valid argument. It's not a guaranteed argument. It might be correct, but it will not be always correct. That's because Peter not being a Ghanaian is not enough reason to show that he's not an African. I mean, Peter could be any other place in Africa, like South Africa or Kenya or any of the others. So that's why we say that denying the antecedent doesn't lead to a guaranteed conclusion. Now remember, we are talking about conclusions that are guaranteed to be correct, conclusions that are valid, conclusions that have the certainty of mathematical conclusions. So once a conclusion does not have the certainty of a mathematical conclusion, then it is not a valid conclusion. So this is what I just explained. The consequent is always a larger class of denotations or members compared to the antecedent. Consequent contains the denotations of both the antecedent and possibly more. So note that sentence. Consequent contains the denotations of both the antecedent and possibly more. The consequent Africans contains more members than the antecedent Ghanaians. So when you deny something of membership in the antecedent class, you have not denied it of membership in the consequent class. But when you deny something of membership in the larger class, containing all the members of a smaller class, you have automatically denied it of membership in the smaller class. When you deny something of membership in the larger class, containing all the members of a smaller class, you have automatically denied it of membership in the smaller class. So because the Ghanaian box is inside the African box, if you are able to show that Peter is not an African at all, then automatically, as a matter of guarantee, he cannot be a Ghanaian. That's why we say that denying the consequent is a valid argument. If you deny the consequent, it's a valid argument. If you say that something is not in the consequent class of items, then automatically it cannot be in the class of the antecedent items. So let's look at the 4 kinds of deductive arguments so that you understand it very well. First of all, we have modus ponens. Modus ponens is an argument that affirms the antecedent. Modus ponens is an argument that affirms the antecedent. All A's are B's. X is an A, therefore X is a B. Or let's look at the conditional version. If something is an A, then it's a B. X is an A, therefore X is a B. To convert it into words, all Ghanaians are Africans. Peter is a Ghanaian, which affirms the antecedent. Peter is an African, which is a valid argument. Now let's look at the fallacy of denying the antecedent. All A's are B's, X is not an A, X is not a B. Or all Ghanaians are Africans, Peter is not a Ghanaian, which denies the antecedent. Therefore, Peter is not an African. So we said it's not a valid argument. Peter could possibly be a Cameroonian. So the technicality, now this is the technicality. You can reach a valid conclusion by denying that something is in the antecedent. Sorry, you can reach a valid conclusion by affirming that something is in the antecedent. If you affirm that something is in the antecedent, then automatically it is in the consequent. If you deny that something is in the antecedent, you have not successfully denied that it is in the consequent. So affirmation is successful, but denial is not always successful. On the other hand, if you affirm that something is in the consequent, you have not automatically affirmed that it's in the antecedent. If you say Peter is an African, that's not enough to show he's a Ghanaian. So affirming the consequent doesn't always successfully affirm the antecedent. But denying the consequent always successfully denies the antecedent. So if you say Peter is not an African, automatically he's not a Ghanaian. So denying the consequent leads to a valid conclusion. Affirming the consequent doesn't lead to a valid conclusion. So you can see that it is opposite for the two parts of for the antecedent for the two parts of the major premise. Affirming the consequent leads to a valid conclusion about affirming the antecedent, which is modus ponens, leads to a valid conclusion about the consequent. But denying the antecedent doesn't lead to a valid conclusion about the consequent. Okay, so let me say it again. Now, there are 4 operations. First of all, affirming the antecedent leads to a valid conclusion about the consequence. But denying the antecedent doesn't lead to a valid conclusion about the consequence. That's the first 2. Now, affirming the consequent doesn't lead to a valid conclusion about the antecedent. But denying the consequent leads to a valid conclusion about the antecedent. So those are the 4 types, the 4 movements. So only 2 of them are valid. Now let's look at modus tollens. All A are B, X is not a B, therefore X is not an A. So modus tollens is an argument that denies the consequent. Modus tollens is an argument that denies the consequent. All A are B, X is not a B, therefore X is not an A. So we have said that since the consequent is bigger than the antecedent, if you deny something in the consequent, automatically you have denied it about the antecedent. So modus tollens is a valid argument. Denying the consequent is a valid operation. Let's put it in words. All Ghanaians are Africans. Michael is not an African, therefore Michael is not a Ghanaian. So you can see that it is correct. If Michael is not an African, then there's no way Michael can be a Ghanaian because all Ghanaians are Africans. Denying that Michael is an African has automatically denied him of being a Ghanaian. So that's why we say that denying the consequent is a valid argument. It leads to a valid conclusion. Now let's look at a department and a university. Now let us imagine that some people are debating whether Kelvin is in the Department of Physics. Imagine that some people are saying Kelvin is in the Department of Physics. Some other people are saying, no, Kelvin is not in the Department of Physics. Some of them would say, Kelvin, we always see Kelvin with us when we are reading our books. And then some people can say, we've seen Kelvin taking examinations with us. And some people will say, oh, we've seen Kelvin taking IA with us. Or somebody will say, Kelvin sometimes comes and sits in our class during lectures in the Department of Physics. or for physics courses. And then some other people say, no, we don't think that Kevin is in the Department of Physics. We rather think Kevin is in chemistry. So some people say, Kevin is part of Department of Physics, and some other people are not sure. And then we decide to go to the registrar to find out whether Kevin is in the Department of Physics or not. And then after 2 days, the registrar announces that Kevin is not enrolled at the University of Ghana. So if Kevin is not enrolled at the University of Ghana, can he be in the Department of Physics? It's not possible. So denying something of membership in the larger class of items automatically denies it of membership in the smaller class. If the smaller class is completely part of the larger class. So look at this argument. All those studying in the Department of Physics are enrolled at the University of Ghana. Kevin is not enrolled at the University of Ghana. So Kevin is not studying in the Department of Physics. So this is a valid argument. The argument is valid. Now just look at the University of Ghana, look at Department of Physics. If you are debating whether Kevin is in the Department of Physics, you can visit the registrar who is in charge of the whole university. Now, if the registrar says Kevin is not enrolled at the University of Ghana, is it possible that he could be enrolled in the Department of Physics? It's not possible. So denying the consequent is a valid argument or would lead you to a valid conclusion. What about affirming the consequent? Affirming the consequent, is it valid? Now, affirming the consequent is not valid. All A are B, X is a B, therefore X is an A. Now let's look at the words. All Ghanaians are Africans. George is an African, therefore George is a Ghanaian. Now, can you conclude that George is a Ghanaian? Or can you guarantee that George is a Ghanaian just because he's an African? Is the information that George is an African sufficient to show you that George is a Ghanaian? So the answer to all these things is no. So that is why we say that affirming the consequent is not a valid argument, or affirming the consequent cannot lead you to a valid conclusion. Now, for the explanation, the consequent Africans contains a logically larger category of denotations than the antecedent Ghanaians. So the fact that George is an African does not necessarily mean that he's a Ghanaian. He may be a South African or a Cameroonian. If we affirm the consequent, we are not sure we can affirm the antecedent. If we affirm the consequent, we are not sure we can affirm the antecedent. In short, if we affirm the consequent, it will land us in the same uncertainty that we saw in the fallacy of denying the antecedent. Somebody was raising his hand. Did someone raise his hand? Okay. Now let's look at another form of the fallacy of affirming the consequent. Another form of affirming the consequent. All A are not B. X is not a B. Therefore, X is an A. All A are not B. X is not a B, therefore X is an A. Is this a case of affirming or denying the consequent? I need people to answer this. Is that a case of denying the antecedent? Let me open your microphones. Okay, so Adam, does this affirm or deny the antecedent? Sorry, does it affirm or deny the consequent?
It denies.
Denies the consequent.
Yes, please.
Yeah, Sadiq Abubakar, do you want to say something else? Or is it the same thing?
Yes, please. It's denies.
Denies. Okay. Because of the minor premise. Now the minor premise is denying. So the two guys are on track according to what we have discussed. But I have a surprise for you guys. I wanted to see. Okay, so the third hand has gone down. Okay, now Dennis Boateng. Did you have something else to say? Dennis Boateng. Dennis, can you unmute your mic?
Yeah, please, it affirms it.
You said it affirms. Okay, so explain why you think it affirms.
It affirms it because if all A is not a B and S is not a B, meaning S is an A. That is, because S is not a B, meaning it's an A.
Okay, now, so now let me come in with the new information. Now, the information I want to download here. There's a lot of noise, so let me mute you guys. Okay. Okay, now, so what is new here is that the first premise or the major premise is denying the consequence. Let me disable your mics. Okay, what is new here is that both premises are denying the consequence. Both premises are denying the consequence. Premise 1 is denying the consequence, and premise 2 is also denying the consequence. So it is not a single denial, it is double denial. Now, according to your mathematics, 2 negatives will give you what? So 2 negatives will give you what?
A positive.
Yeah, so 2 negatives will give you a positive.
Yes.
They're positive.
Positive.
If the first premise is denying and the second premise is also denying,
Positive.
and the two of them are denying the same thing, if the two premises are denying the same thing, If the two premises are denying the same thing, then it means that they are affirming one another. Once the two premises are denying the same thing, then it means the second premise is actually affirming the first one. So just note that two negatives will give you a positive. You need to check well. Check whether there's a negative in both premises or in just one of them. Now look at it in words. All human beings are not goats. X is not a goat, so X is a human being. All human beings are not goats. X is not a goat. So the two negatives will give you a positive. And if it is a positive, then it means that it is an argument that affirms the consequent. If it's a positive, then it means it's an argument that affirms the consequent. An argument that affirms the consequent is not a valid argument. So that means automatically that this is not a valid argument. The argument has to be invalid. So all you can do is to check the argument in words to find out for yourself why it is invalid. If you look at this sentence, for instance, all human beings are not goats, X is not a goat, therefore X is a human being. Now, yes, so the first sentence is saying that all human beings are not goats. And then the second one says X is not a goat. But it doesn't tell you whether X is a human being. It just says X is not a goat. And then the conclusion is X is a human being. The conclusion is not warranted because you don't have enough information to conclude that X is just because X is not a goat doesn't mean it's a human being. X could be any other creature, a lion or a zebra or a crocodile. So whenever you see affirming the consequent, it must be wrong, no matter what. All you need to do is use your common sense, check the argument, and eventually you will see why it's invalid. But you need to use the rules. Just use the rules and you stay safe. You only affirm the antecedent or deny the consequent to reach a valid conclusion. Any other operation is invalid. If you deny the antecedent, it will be invalid. If you affirm the consequent, it will be invalid, no matter what. So again, not being a goat is a logically larger category than all human beings. So the fact that X is not a goat doesn't necessarily mean that X is a human being. X could be a giraffe or a tiger. Now that brings us to conclusion about modus ponens, modus tollens, and their corresponding fallacies. So affirming the antecedent is modus ponens. Denying the antecedent is called the fallacy of denying the antecedent. Affirming the consequent is the fallacy of affirming the consequent. Denying the consequent is called modus tollens, modus tollens. So of the four of them, modus ponens, modus tollens are valid. The other two are invalid. Now let's move on to, so modus ponens and modus tollens are the first two kinds of deductive reasoning. The first two kinds of deductive reasoning are modus ponens and modus tollens. The third one, the fourth one, is the hypothetical syllogism. The fourth one is the hypothetical syllogism. This is an argument where the consequent of an initial or first premise becomes the antecedent of a second or subsequent premise. An argument where the consequent of an initial or first premise becomes the antecedent of a second or subsequent premise. And subsequent premises feature the consequence of their predecessors as their antecedents. And then the conclusion pairs the very first antecedent and the very last consequent. So these are the basic ways to identify a hypothetical syllogism. Remember that a modus ponens affirms the antecedent, modus tollens denies the consequent, and then their fallacies do the opposite. But when you see an argument where the consequent of premise 1 becomes the antecedent of premise 2, and then the consequent of premise 2 becomes the antecedent of premise 3. And if there are more premises, the consequent of premise 3 becomes the antecedent of premise 4. The consequent of premise 3 becomes the antecedent of premise 5. And it just continues. And then what the conclusion does is get the very first antecedent and also get the very last antecedent and then bring them together. That's a hypothetical argument. Look at an example. All A are B, all B are C, therefore all A are C. You can also have all A are B, all B are C, all C are D, all D are E, all E are F, all F are G, therefore all A are G. Or you can continue to Z, and then the conclusion will be therefore all A are Z. That's how to identify a hypothetical argument. Look at the conditional version. If A then B, if B then C. Therefore, if A then C. Or if A then B, if B then C, if C then D, if D then E, if E then F, if F then H. Continuously. All you need to do, get the first antecedent and the last consequent, and they form the conclusion. Let's put it in words. All Ghanaians are Africans. All Africans are human beings. Therefore, all Ghanaians are human beings. For the conditional, if you are a Ghanaian, then you are an African. If you are an African, then you are a human being. Therefore, if you are a Ghanaian, then you are a human being. So for the explanation, we notice that the consequent of the first premise, which is B, becomes the antecedent of the second premise. And the antecedent of the second premise, which is the consequent of the first premise, leads us to a new party, which is C, as the consequent. Any subsequent premise will typically feature the consequent of its predecessor, so that at the end of the day, the antecedent and then the antecedent is linked conditionally to a fresh party. Now let's look at two fallacies of hypothetical syllogism. The hypothetical the hypothetical argument has two kinds of fallacies. The first one is this: all A are B, all B are C. Therefore, all C are A. Now the conclusion is supposed to be all A are C. But it reverses the terms and then says all C are A. Look at the conditional. If A, then B. If B, then C. Therefore, if C, then A. It just turns it upside down. Put it in words so that you see the confusion it generates or the contradiction. All Ghanaians are Africans. All Africans are human beings. Therefore, all human beings are Ghanaians, which is completely illogical. Look at the conditional. If you are a Ghanaian, then you are an African. If you are an African, then you are a human being. Therefore, if you are a human being, then you are a Ghanaian. So that's not true. So this is the first hypothetical fallacy. Let's look at the second hypothetical fallacy. All A are C. Now it's supposed to be all A are B, but here we are told all A are C. Jumping B. All A are C. All B are C. Therefore, all A are B. So this is a totally different argument. It actually looks attractive, and if you don't take time, it can convince you. Look at the conditional. If A, then C. If B, then C. Therefore, on that basis, if A, then B. Just because A is equated to C and B is equated to C, it concludes that A and B are the same. But that's not true. Let's put it in words so that you see the fallacy. All Ghanaians are Africans. All Kenyans are Africans. Therefore, all Ghanaians are Kenyans. So you can see it doesn't always follow. If you are a Ghanaian, then you are an African. If you are a Kenyan, then you're an African. Therefore, if you are a Ghanaian, then you are a Kenyan. Now, sometimes this argument can be true by accident. Sometimes it can be true by accident. Ghanaians are human beings. All Ghanaians are human beings. All Africans are human beings. Therefore, all Ghanaians are Africans. So sometimes it can be true by accident. But the fact that it is true by accident doesn't mean that the argument is correct. The argument is not correct. Now, if you look at the conclusion, all Ghanaians are Africans. You didn't get that conclusion from the premises. There's nothing in the premises that gives you that conclusion. You didn't know that all Ghanaians are Africans by looking at the premises. None of the premises tells you that at all. So if you never knew that before seeing the premises, there's no way you could have arrived at the conclusion. You only arrived at that kind of conclusion because of your prior knowledge. So that means the argument itself cannot even produce that conclusion. Now let's look at the last type of deductive argument. So up till now, we have seen three types of deductive argument: modus ponens, modus tollens, and hypothetical syllogism. Now the fourth one is called the disjunctive syllogism. This is a syllogism where the main premise is a disjunctive, either or. The main premise is a disjunctive, either or. When we affirm something of any of the disjunctive items, then we have automatically denied the other disjunctive part. A syllogism where the main premise is a disjunctive, an either or statement. When we affirm something of any of the disjunctive items, then we have automatically denied the other disjunctive part. Example, either A is true or B is true. A is true, so B is false. Or either A is true or B is true. B is true, so A is false. Let's put it in words. Either I became a reverend father or I got married. I got married, so I did not become a reverend father. Or either I became a reverend father or I got married. I became a reverend father, so I did not get married. If you choose one, then you have rejected the other, because it's the main premise is an either or statement. Okay, let's exercise our brain a little bit. Determine what kind of argument this is. What kind of argument is this? Anytime he goes to town, he passes by my mother's house. Anytime he goes to town, he passes by my mother's house. Today, he passed by my mother's house. So he went to town. What kind of argument is this? Is this a modus ponens or a fallacy of denying the antecedent? Or is it a modus tollens, or is it a fallacy of affirming the consequent? Or is it a hypothetical syllogism? Or is it a disjunctive syllogism?
Modus theory.
Modus what? Modus tollens. Okay, please. Why is it a modus tollens? Explain why it's a modus tollens.
Validity.
So who can explain? Adam, your hand is down. Who can explain why it is a modus tollens? Does it affirm or deny the antecedent, or does it affirm or deny the consequent?
So I think it affirms the antecedent.
Affirms the antecedent. Okay, let's take the first steps. Let's do it step by step. Now you are supposed to solve this like your mathematical problem. So I'll use this opportunity to teach you how to solve the problem. First of all, you have to identify the major premise. What is the major premise?
He passes by my.
The major premise. Now, for your information, the major premise is the premise that contains the biggest information. The premises containing the biggest information is the major premise. So which one is the major premise?
Anytime he goes to town, he passes by my mother's house.
Okay. Yes, so that's the major premise. Anytime he goes to town, he passes by my mother's house. That's where you get the biggest information. That's where you get the most information. So that is the major premise. That is a premise you can convert into a conditional. So you can convert it into a conditional. And in fact, it is already in a quasi-conditional form. Anytime to be a strict conditional, you can say, if he goes to town, he passes by my mother's house. If he goes to town, he passes by my mother's house. Anytime he goes, so already it is in a kind of conditional form. So that means the antecedent is what? The antecedent is what?
Today he passed by my mother's house.
Anytime he goes to town.
Okay, anytime it goes to town. The antecedent is part of the major premise. You don't locate the antecedent in the minor premise. You can only locate the antecedent in the major premise. So that means anytime he goes to town. And the consequence is he passes by my mother's house. Now, on the basis of this information, what does the minor premise do? Does the minor premise affirm or deny the antecedent, or does it affirm or deny the consequence?
It affirms the consequence.
It affirms the consequence.
It affirms the consequence. And from all that we have been doing, we have been saying time and time again that affirming the consequence is a fallacy. It's an invalid argument. It is only denying the consequence that can be valid. So that means that this argument affirming the consequence is invalid. Now that you have known from the rules of deductive reasoning that it's invalid, the next thing is to ask yourself, by looking at by looking at the argument, why is it invalid? Why is the argument invalid? By looking at the argument.
Because
it
the fact
affirms
that
the consequence.
One at a time. Somebody said the fact that what?
That he passes my mother's house doesn't mean that always he goes to town. It may be that he passes by my mother's house, but he goes to a friend's place.
Okay, so that's correct. That he passed by my mother's house doesn't always mean he goes to town. Now we are told that anytime he goes to town, he passes by my mother's house. Yes. For him to go to town, he must pass by my mother's house. But the town is not the only place he can go when he passes by my mother's house. He can pass by my mother's house to go to his girlfriend's place just next door. So that tells you from common sense why the argument is invalid. But before you use the common sense approach, you must use, before you use the common sense approach, you must first of all use the rules. You must apply the rules. You have to apply the rules first before you go to the level of common sense. So from the rules, affirming consequence is wrong, it's invalid. Then when you have known that, then you come down to the common sense approach and check the sentence again, check the argument again, and try to find out for yourself why it's invalid. So those are the two steps. The first step is to apply the rules. So the first step is to apply the rules. The second step is to use common sense to confirm the rules. Before you apply the rules, you have to identify the major premise. When you have identified the major premise, then you divide the major premise into the antecedent and the consequent. When you have done that, you have your antecedent and your consequent, then you ask yourself, what is the minor premise doing? Is the minor premise affirming or denying the antecedent, or is the minor premise affirming or denying the consequent? Which of the four operations? When you have answered that, then you ask yourself, is it valid? When you have answered the validity question, then you have gotten your answer. If you have any time, you might not have time. If you don't have time, you just apply the rules. If you have time, when you have found out from the rules what the correct answer is, then you can check the argument with your common sense to find out why the rules are saying what they are saying. Okay, so someone's hand is up. Seth, you want to ask a question? Seth, your hand has been up for a while.
Sir, please, it's okay.
Okay, that's fine. So I just want you guys to be with me at each stage. I don't want you guys to miss anything, so that if I'm going to a new slide, I know that all of you are moving on cleanly to the new slide. Now let's answer correctly. We deduce correctly when we deny the antecedent. True or false? We deduce correctly
False.
when we deny the antecedent. True or false?
False.
False.
False. Okay. We deduce correctly when we affirm the antecedent. True or false?
True.
True.
Okay. Number 3. We deduce correctly when we deny the consequence. True or false?
True.
True.
Number 4. We deduce correctly when we affirm the consequence. True or false?
False.
Okay. Okay, good. All right. Now let's look at this. Now we are rounding up. In fact, we've done the main thing. Now this is just a minor issue. Validity versus soundness. Now the 4 types of deductive syllogism are 4 ways of making deductively valid arguments. The modus ponens, modus tollens, hypothetical syllogism, and the disjunctive syllogism. The 4 of them are valid arguments. And we've also seen their fallacies. Now, a valid argument is an argument whose premises are logically consistent with its conclusion. Just give me a second.
This thing can sometimes be confusing.
Okay, so let's mute everyone. Okay, now we have some quiet. Now, a valid argument is an argument whose premises are logically consistent with its conclusion. The premises of a valid argument necessarily imply its conclusion. I'm getting a call from quality assurance. So let me just pick it up and tell them I'll call them later. Okay. So an invalid argument is an argument whose premises do not logically imply the conclusion. Now, the relationship between the premises and the conclusion is not that of logical necessity. So we've seen these things. Now, we saw 4 valid arguments: modus ponens, modus tollens, hypothetical syllogism, and disjunctive syllogism. So the 4 of them are valid, but we saw some invalid ones as well. Denying the antecedent, affirming the consequent, they are invalid. Then we saw 2 hypothetical fallacies. Now, all of these fallacies, we call them the formal fallacies. They're called the formal fallacies. Now, so I'm making this clarification because very soon we're going to be looking at informal fallacies. Now, today we have seen formal fallacies. Now, an argument can be valid but not sound. Now, we say that an argument is valid if it follows the rules. If it affirms the antecedent, then it's valid. If it denies the consequent, it is valid.
Hello, Doc. Sir, there is a feedback. It's disturbing. There is a feedback when you talk. There is a big feedback that follows.
Okay, let me. Okay. So I have disabled your microphones so that it cuts the feedback off. Okay, so now let me go back. So we've talked about valid arguments. A valid argument is the one where the premises make the conclusion necessary. So you can see from modus ponens, modus tollens, that the premises make the conclusion necessary, and the conclusion follows with certainty. Even the hypothetical and the disjunctive, you can see that the premises make the conclusion necessary, the conclusion follows with certainty, and they lead you to only one conclusion. You can't change the conclusion. There's no possibility of more than one conclusion. It's just one conclusion. That's why we call them valid arguments. They have the accuracy of mathematical or arithmetical operations. But an invalid argument doesn't have those things. You saw that when you deny the antecedent, the conclusion is not guaranteed. If you affirm the consequent, the conclusion is not guaranteed. In fact, if you do any of those things, it can lead you to more than one legitimate conclusion. So that's the distinction between valid and invalid. Now, all those fallacies we saw, denying the antecedent, affirming the consequent, the 2 hypothetical fallacies, we call them formal fallacies. So all the fallacies we did today are formal fallacies. Later on, we're going to look at informal fallacies. Now, we call these ones formal fallacies because they are failures of a formal operation. A deductive argument is a formal way of arguing. That's the most formal form of argument. Other arguments are, they don't have this kind of accuracy, this level of accuracy. Now, an argument can be valid but not sound. Let's look at this. Premise 1. All human beings are immortal. Peter is a human being, therefore Peter is immortal. Now, this argument is valid because it is a correct modus ponens. It affirms the antecedent, so the argument is valid. But is it true? Is the conclusion true? the conclusion is not true because no human being is immortal. Peter cannot be immortal. So it is valid because it is a correct modus ponens, but it is not sound because one of the premises is not true. And then that affected the conclusion as well. So this argument is valid, but not sound. In order for an argument to be sound, it has to be both valid and all the statements in the argument have to be true. So validity and truth are required for soundness. If you have validity alone, but you don't have the truth, then the argument is not sound. Or we say the argument is unsound. Look at other examples. All men are mammals. All mammals must get killed. Therefore, all men must get killed. Is this a valid argument? Yes, it is a valid argument. Now, what kind of argument is this? First of all, I want you guys to identify this type of argument because now let me open up these microphones. So who can tell us what kind of argument this is?
Hypothetical in the definition. Hypothetical.
Hypothetical. Yes. All men are mammals, all mammals must get killed, therefore all men must get killed. All A are B, all B are C, therefore all A are C. So that's hypothetical. So the argument is valid because it is a valid hypothetical argument. But is the argument true? The argument is not true because there is a falsehood in premise 2. And the falsehood in premise 2 also crept into the conclusion. So because there is falsehood, the argument is valid but not sound. You can also have invalid argument with a true conclusion. You can have a conclusion that is accidentally true in an invalid argument. Now look at this example. Democracy is better than other forms of political organization because citizens in a democracy are holier than citizens in another form of political organization. Now, this is an example of an argument with only one premise. The premise is the second part of the sentence. Because citizens in a democracy are holier than, that's a premise. The conclusion is the first part. Democracy is better than other forms of political organization. Okay, so the first part is the conclusion. Democracy is better than other forms of political organization. So that's a conclusion. Then what follows is the premise, because citizens in a democracy are holier than citizens in other, Now, is the conclusion true? Democracy is better than other forms of political organization. Everybody, everybody understands that democracy is better than other forms of political organization, such as monarchy, military, and what have you. So the conclusion is true. But what about the premise? Because citizens in a democracy are holier than, are citizens in a democracy holier than citizens in other? No, that cannot be true. So you have a true conclusion in an invalid argument. The premise is false. The premise about being holier is false, but it leads to a true conclusion. So the conclusion is true, but the premise is wrong. That's why we call it an invalid argument with a true conclusion. Now, true conclusion alone does not make an invalid argument correct. So we have valid and sound. To be sound, all the premises in a valid argument must be true. All men are mortal, Peter is a man, therefore Peter is mortal. So all the statements are true, and it is a valid modus ponens. So the argument is both valid and sound. So we have three forms. We have valid and sound, valid and unsound, and then we have invalid and unsound. Now, valid and sound. All snakes are reptiles. Cobra is a snake, which affirms the antecedent. Therefore, cobra is a reptile. So it is valid because it follows the correct rule for deductive reasoning. It affirms the antecedent. And it is true because all the premises are true. Valid and unsound. All snakes are reptiles. Mosquitoes are snakes. Therefore, mosquitoes are reptiles. So this is valid because it affirms the antecedent. But it is unsound because one of the premises is not true. You can have both invalid and unsound, which is a double jeopardy. All snakes are reptiles. Mosquitoes are reptiles. Therefore, mosquitoes are snakes. It is invalid because the argument affirms the consequent, which is invalid. It is also unsound because one of the premises is not true. Is an invalid but sound argument possible? No. An invalid argument is already unsound, even if the premises and conclusion are all true. All Ghanaians are Africans, Kofi is an African, therefore Kofi is a Ghanaian. So the argument is not sound because Kofi being an African does not provide enough justification to show that Kofi is a Ghanaian. So for that reason, we cannot say that invalid arguments can be sound in any way. Invalid arguments can be correct by accident, only by accident. It can happen that Kofi is a Ghanaian, but this argument does not present you with the information to know that, because being an African is just not enough. So validity is needed for soundness. But soundness is not needed for validity. So validity is needed for soundness, but soundness is not needed for validity. Some arguments are valid but not true. Now, soundness needs both validity and truth. Now, let's exercise ourselves a little, because now we've come a long way. Identify the missing premise in each of the following deductive arguments. Now, so there is a missing premise here. All military men play football. Bob plays football. What is the missing premise?
Bob is a military man.
Bob is a military man.
Bob is a military man. Bob is a military man.
Bob is
That's
a military
correct. That's correct. Number two, All Americans are human beings. All Americans are human beings. All Americans are mammals. All Americans are human beings. All Americans are mammals.
All human beings are mammals.
All human beings are mammals. Well, that's correct. All right, so let's move on. Answer correctly. Which fallacy is committed by the following? All A's are C's, all B's are C's, therefore all A's are B's. What kind of argument is this?
Second fallacy.
You need to find out the kind of argument before you find out the kind of fallacy.
It's a hypothetical argument.
Hypothetical argument. So that means it's a hypothetical fallacy. All Ghanaians are Africans, all Kenyans are Africans, therefore all Ghanaians are Kenyans. Okay. Describe the following arguments. All Europeans are not my friends. Ben is not a European, therefore Ben is my friend. Or you can look at the second one. No European is my friend. Ben is not a European, therefore Ben is my friend. What kind of argument is this?
Fallacy of modus ponens.
Yeah,
So please, fallacy of modus ponens. Yeah, right.
Fallacy of modus ponens. So
That's it.
an argument that denies the antecedent. Okay,
Yes,
so
sir.
let's cross-check by, first of all, identifying the major premise. What's the major premise?
All Europeans are not my.
All Europeans are not my friend. That's the major premise. Or no European is my friend. Then the minor premise says Ben is not a European. So the minor premise is saying something about the antecedent.
It's denying the antecedent.
Deny the antecedent. Deny the antecedent. Okay, so it says Ben is not a European. So it appears to be denying the antecedent. But there happens to be a negativity in the major premise. No European.
It affirms.
It affirms. So two negatives. give you a positive. Okay. So that's the end of the class. We shall be doing inductive reasoning next week. For now, let's attend to some questions. So if you have any questions, this is the time to ask them before I stop the recording.
Hello?
And then, yeah, go ahead.
Sir, I have a question, please. Hello?
Yes, go ahead.
Hello? Yeah, please. I actually joined class 15 minutes late, and then I'm kind of finding it difficult to point out the antecedent from the consequence.
Okay, that means you are missing okay, that means you are missing a lot of information. You have to wait until you get the video so that you watch the video from the beginning and get all the information you need to be able to know the differences between the two of them. And in fact, anyone who joined the class up to 10 minutes late, the only way you can go through all of this is to watch the video. But also those who have followed the class from the very beginning, you can also watch the videos to strengthen your understanding. You know, even if you were early, I encourage you to watch the videos as well.
Please, where can you watch the videos?
So I'll send the video to the coordinator. I used to post it on your resources folder, but now if I post it to your now you are sharing the same resources folder with other groups. So if I send it to your resources folder, other groups will see it too, and I don't teach it. So the coordinator said I have to send it to her, and then she will send it to your group in particular, you know, without interfering with the other groups. So when I send it to her, she will find a way to get it to you.
Thank you, sir.
All right. So let me proceed to stop the recording. Yes.
So I want to find out more about IE. How it's going to be like.
The IA. Yeah, the IA. I'm not involved in setting the IA, so I wouldn't know the details. But I'm sure by the time they start designing your IA, I might know a few things about it. But I'm not going to know the internal, you know, frameworks because of my lack of involvement. You know, your IA is gonna be handled by the coordinator. You know.
They said they sent it through email to us.
You mean multiple choice?
Yes, it's multiple choice.
Okay, multiple choice. Yes, of course. But that wouldn't be the only component. You might need to write short essays, you know. I'm sure they are going to test you in different ways, not only the multiple choice.
Sir, hello, sir.
Yes.
Just for clarity purpose, I got the way that if the statement affirms the antecedent and if it denies the consequence, it's valid. And if it denies the antecedents and affirms the consequence, it's invalid. I got that, but I wanted you to clarify this for me. Which of them falls under the modus polus and which of them fall under the modus telling. So telling of what?
Yeah, the two of them are descriptions of the two of them are descriptions of the valid arguments. Modus ponens is the description of affirming the antecedent, and then modus tollens is the description of denying the consequence. So the two of them are the descriptions of the valid arguments.
Hello, sir.
Yes.
Yeah, I've got that one. If time is, what about the disjunctive arguments?
Yeah, the disjunctive, that's the name. Disjunctive argument, that's the name, just like modus ponens. You have modus ponens, modus tollens, hypothetical, and disjunctive. Those are the four valid arguments.
Yeah, and right now after this, I know what exactly is the modus ponens, and then the hypothetical argument, but I don't have a clear idea which of them. What exactly is the disjunctive argument?
Yeah, the disjunctive argument is the one whose major premise is a disjunctive statement, an either-or statement. Were you around when we treated the disjunctive?
Yeah, yes, sir. Yes, I was around.
So that is the argument where the major premise is a disjunctive statement. So other statements, kind of draw information from the disjunctive statement. So if you say either this or this, and you choose this, then you've rejected the other.
Okay.
Okay.
Please, I have a question.
So,
Please, I have a question.
yeah, go ahead.
Please, concerning the last example that we gave, that no, all Europeans are not my friend. So, Ben is not a European, so he is my friend. Please, how does it become a fallacy of modus ponens? I understand that we are affirming the antecedents. So I don't get why it becomes a fallacy of modus ponens.
Oh, if it affirms the antecedents, then it's modus ponens. It's not a
Yes.
fallacy.
Okay.
If it affirms the antecedent, then it is modus ponens. It's not the fallacy. The fallacy is to deny the antecedent.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes, and then you don't call it fallacy of modus ponens. You call it fallacy of denying the antecedent.
Okay.
Yes. And the other one, you call it fallacy of affirming the consequence. You wouldn't say fallacy of modus tollens. Okay. So now I'm stopping the recording.